Religions are like pure rain, falling on earth and nourishing life. It brings about beautiful flowers, trees, and vegetation. In the same way rain is necessary for life, religion and morality are necessary to maintain peace, serenity, and hope. A Legacy of Peace is a documentary presentation that depicts the true nature of Islam and its relationship with the beliefs of other religions. Its primary goal is to clarify some of the misconceptions about the Islamic faith and set the stage for understanding and tolerance among all people and all religions. The components of the mission of the Prophet Muhammad, Islam's affirmation of Judaism and Christianity, Muhammad's rational approach to life as a whole will be discussed. The documentary will also speak about the issue of state versus religion, what jihad means, Muhammad's use of marriage to end tribal strife, and how Islam reformed the status of women's rights and their role in societies. These are some of the topics that will be discussed in this long-awaited film. To better understand Islam and how its philosophies evolved, we will walk you through many of the events leading to the rise of this faith, and more importantly, bridge the perceived gap between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Just as Judaism turns to Moses for their teachings, and the Christians believe that Jesus was sent by God, the Muslims believe that Prophet Muhammad received the revelation of Islam. In the early 600 AD, in the city of Mecca in the Arabian Peninsula, Islam was born to continue the religious traditions set out from the dawn of mankind. The Prophet Muhammad was from the Hashim clan of the Quraysh tribe that ruled the city during that time. In the early 7th century, Arabia was a harsh wilderness inhabited by people who mostly worshipped idols and were torn with endless tribal wars. Survival was mostly possible by tribal dominance. Nobody would have dreamed that this violent and terrifying region was about to give birth to a world religion that would soon bring about peace and create strong spiritual, intellectual, social, and political reforms. In her book, Muhammad, a biography of the Prophet, Karen Armstrong stated, "When Muhammad brought his revelation to his people, Arabia was outside the civilized world, and its political and social order was disintegrating. There was an urgent need for a new political solution, and in the 7th century, such a solution would inevitably be religious." From an early age, Muhammad was known to be passionate, trustworthy, and spiritually gifted. He would often reflect and withdraw to a cave near Mecca called Cave Hira to ponder and meditate. At the age of 40, during one of his retreats, Muslims believe Archangel Gabriel appeared to him with a message from God. He said to him, "O Muhammad, read." Muhammad was terrified. He said, "I cannot read." Archangel Gabriel repeated, "O Muhammad, read." Muhammad replied, "But I cannot read." Then he took Muhammad into his arms and recited, "Read, in the name of your Lord, who created man from a clinging substance. Read, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man that which he knew not." Thus started Islam's revelation with the word read, and the revelation continued to occur periodically over a period of 23 years, which form the Holy Quran. As a result of this revelation, rationality, spirituality, trade, science, and art thrived in the region to create the Golden Age of Islam. Out of this Golden Age of Islam grew the seeds of the Renaissance, the beginning of Europe's escape from the Dark Ages, where reason and knowledge were rejected.
Was told to use intellectual capacity. It means reason. Use your reason. So that had such, can you imagine the impact if we knew today that in religion we're supposed to use reason? In the matters of faith, if we don't use our reason, we'll be lost. That's the contribution that Islam gave, and that's why it changed civilization. No one before said use your reason. Before it was repression based on the priesthood or the hierarchy, the church. Whoever was in control didn't want the common people to learn about things. They wanted to protect their interests.
During the great Muslim empires, the Christian world was going through its dark ages. And this shifts tremendously when the Christian world comes out of the Dark Ages, because indeed the Christian world looks to that great Islamic heritage and past to learn about the great philosophers of the West. In many ways, it was the Muslim sages that passed on knowledge of Greek philosophy, and not only passed on that knowledge of Aristotle and Plato and Plotinus, but actually passed on and enhanced and developed form, so that it then becomes possible for the great sages of Christendom, whether it's Aquinas or Bonaventure or Albert the Great and many others, to in fact be seen as building on, if you will, their Muslim masters, their Muslim teachers.
The Arabic word Islam is related to Silm and Salam. It means peace and a wholesome surrender to God.
It is in the Quran that the religion is Islam. We translate this to English, that the religion with God is to surrender to God.
Islam itself means submission to the will of God.
The submission to the will of God is profoundly natural and is in harmony with the divine laws of existence. Muslims believe everything in the natural world, including man, submit to God. Animals, flowers, trees, winds, oceans, fish, earth, moon, and heavens do not have a choice about whether to submit to God or not. Muslims believe man alone was given the faculty of choice. Those who choose to submit to God willingly, their submission comes in harmony with nature. But those who repulse the guidance of God will be returning to Him in submission and death, despite their unwillingness in life. Muslims believe that all heavenly religions have sprung from the one fountain of Almighty God. And with this deeply held belief, Islam enforces the beliefs at the core of Judaism and Christianity. Say, we believe in God and what has been revealed to us, and what was revealed to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants, and in what was given to Moses and Jesus and to the prophets from their Lord. We make no distinction between any of them, and we are Muslims, submitting to Him. Quran 3:84.
Islam is the culmination of the Abrahamic religions.
I couldn't understand what was connecting us to the Muslims. Why? Explain that to me.
لم أكن أحد. We as Muslims and Christians are in one camp.
لا نفرق.
We do not discriminate between a Muslim and a Christian.
النبي واجبات.
Prophet Muhammad says about the people of the Holy Book that our rights are their rights and our duties and their duties are the same.
نحن أبناء.
We believe in this case what Prophet Muhammad says about himself and his brother prophets and messengers. We prophets are brothers. Our religion is one, though our procedural work is diverse.
أصل الدين واحد.
The source of religion is one.
We Muslims consider that Islam is the continuity of the previous Abrahamic religions in this final form of Islam.
To Muslims, Muhammad is the last prophet, continuing the message of Moses and Jesus Christ.
Muhammad emerges within Islam as the final prophet. His example is such within the Muslim community that popularly he's often referred to as the living Quran. That is, he is the model, his practice, his sunnah, what the prophet said and did.
The Arabic word Allah is the proper name for God, Lord of the creation, maker and sustainer of this universe and beyond.
I think that there's a great misunderstanding. People act as if Allah is somehow a special private name, when in fact it's the Arabic word for God.
There's of course one God in the universe, and Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all relate to this same God. In medieval Judaism, the medieval commentators who wrote in Arabic referred to that God as Allah, just as the Muslims and Christian commentators also referred to God as Allah.
God, or Allah, has many attributes. Some of these attributes are the granter of peace and mercy, the patient, the pure, the forgiver, the compassionate, the judge, and the wise. Muslims believe from the unity of God comes the unity of the universe and the unity of religion. From this unity stems the fraternity of all people and all beliefs.
وأحب الخلق إلى الله أنفعهم لعياله.
Prophet Muhammad says, all creatures are God's dependents. He didn't say the Muslims only or the Christians or the Jews. All creatures are God's dependents. The most lovable to God is he who is most helpful to God's dependents.
Everything is created by the one God, and so for Muslims, the idea is that all people come from the same roots.
Prophet Muhammad said, "None of you will be a true believer unless he loves for his fellow believer what he loves for himself." Although Islam was born in the height of recorded history in the early 600s, it is one of the most misunderstood religions. There are many unfound myths surrounding Islam that cause fear, confusion, and misinterpretation. Some believe the reason for this misunderstanding comes from the fact that most of the other religions do not teach Islam in their sermons, and vice versa.
I am a bit taken aback to discover that I'm 53 years old and I've been an ordained minister in the Christian church for 19 years, and my education about Islam is beginning today. That all through my lifetime and all through my life as a Christian and my training to be an ordained minister, I did not have exposure to the Islamic tradition, the Islamic faith, the sacred texts of Islam. I had very little opportunity to interact with people who practiced the Muslim faith, and so I feel like I'm at a beginning stage.
The Quran is a complete code of guidance and the source of spiritual nourishment, healing, and mercy for all believers. It stands today as it was revealed to Prophet Muhammad in its original state. All three of the major religions have a book that helps them interpret the will of God. For the Muslims, this book is the Quran. The Quran describes the teachings of Prophet Muhammad in three major categories: the Holy Quran, or Al-Kitab, wisdom, hikmah, and inner self-purification, tazkiyah. These three fundamental categories supplement one another. The first, Al-Kitab, produces a person with a knowledge that the Prophet wanted to bestow on all Muslims. This knowledge includes the basis of sciences, the fundamentals of Islam, its beliefs, laws, and the stories and lessons from the earlier prophets. The second, wisdom, functions to produce a people who are successful in running their lives, affairs, and businesses. The third category, inner self-purification, tazkiyah, is an institution whose function is to produce humble and pious people. The three fundamentals combine to make up the ingredients necessary to make a true believer. The wisdom is a management tool that utilizes cause and effect as a guide in producing the desired and just result. It teaches the Muslim to do what is right and appropriate at the right time and in the right place.
There are 4 verses in the Quran which speaks about tazkiyah and hikmah, meaning the inner self purification and instructing the wisdom and the scriptures to people.
Al-hikmah, the wisdom, is to do the right thing in the right manner, in the right place.
Tazkiyah, or inner self purification, plays a major, very significant role in the success of the person and the societies. The Quran states that indeed, truly, he is successful whoever purifies his soul, and he's a failure whoever corrupts his soul.
To Muslims, at the center of the soul and conscience is the heart. God addressed Prophet Muhammad saying that he will accept those who turn to him in penitence, those who believe, and whose hearts find completion in the remembrance of Allah. For without doubt in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find comfort.
In the Quran, talking about the mission of the prophets, that their main goal was to teach the book, the wisdom, and the tazkiyah, the purification of the heart.
When the heart is cleansed from all vices and enlightened by the guidance of Allah, the rest of the body and all the senses will follow accordingly. Muslims believe that the faith in the heart wears out, just as clothes do, and that dhikr, or the recollection of Allah, renews the faith in the heart. The Prophet said, "Indeed, everything can be polished, and the polish of the hearts is dhikrullah, or the remembrance of Allah."
Serenity is a result of contemplation and zikr. If we think from our heart, then our heart becomes our conscience.
During the period Muhammad was receiving his revelation on Mount Hira, he started calling his people to worship the one God, Allah, and stop worshiping idols. He was rejected just as Moses and Jesus were during their times. Only a few followed his call. The Prophet and those who did follow him soon became Quraysh's targets of attacks, humiliation, torture, and persecution. Several Muslims were tortured to death. Some of the followers of Muhammad's were slaves and servants who were tortured and killed by their masters. In response to the torture against his followers, Prophet Muhammad did not follow what was common in Arabia, which was to retaliate with violence. Instead, he and some of his companions purchased the servants and slaves and set them free. To further minimize violence in a civilized manner, Prophet Muhammad conducted his meetings with his companions secretly at the house of Ibn al-Arqam. He asked his followers not to openly proclaim their faith while they were amongst the Meccans and the Quraysh tribe. As a result of several pagans' attacks on the Muslims as they performed their prayers at the Kaaba, Prophet Muhammad asked his companions to read their formal prayers silently instead of loudly, so as not to provoke Quraysh and cause violence. The evening and early morning time prayers were kept unchanged, since they are mostly performed in privacy. Some believe that Prophet Muhammad modified the form of worship for the purpose of eliminating hostility and violence. As a sign of reverence for the Prophet's actions, Muslims all over the world perform their noon and afternoon prayers silently. This simple act is substantial proof of Islam's policy of establishing peace and preventing vehement actions.
So the Prophet ordered them to recite the Quran silently.
This also shows that he was very careful about the sensitivities of the people.
For the next few years, the Quraysh tribe intensified their offense against the Muslims. The Prophet feared for the lives of his followers, so he started looking for protection and alliances. The closest to him was the Christian monarch of Abyssinia, King Asmaha Negus.
When Muslims were persecuted in Mecca, the Prophet told his followers that here the life is difficult for you, but then in another part, in Africa, in Abyssinia, there is a ruler who is very just. He's a Christian, but he's very just. His name was Najashi or Negos, and the Prophet said, why not migrate there? And you will find fair treatment in his state, in his government. And so many Muslims migrated. Almost 100 people migrated from Mecca to Abyssinia, and very interesting stories are mentioned that when they came there and people of Mecca, they sent some people to pursue them, and they went to the king and they told the king that there are people who ran away, some young people, they ran away from their homes, some slaves who ran away from their masters, we would like that you send them back. The king said, but I want to hear them, let them come and speak. And when Muslim speaker spoke on behalf of other Muslims and explained what the message of Islam is, Najashi said, no, you have every right to practice your religion. And he allowed them to live there. And Muslims, they reciprocated with loyalty to that king. They were very loyal to the king, and they helped him in his battles with his enemies because they recognized this goodness that he did.
The Quran also speaks about the people of the book, who are Christians and Jews. Islam holds a special status for them, since they received revelations from God and believe in the Day of Reckoning.
It is wrong to say that Islam teaches violence between Muslims and Christians or Muslims and Jews. Islam emphasizes that you have these two traditions especially, Judaism and Christianity, they have many things in common. And you have to recognize this commonality and have better relations with them. Surah number 16, Allah says that when you discuss with the people of the book any matters, you discuss with them in a nice manner. Even when you argue with them in a nice manner. In Surah number 3, it says, قُلْ يَا أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ تَعَالَوْا إِلَىٰ كَلِمَةٍ سَوَاءٍ. O people of the book, come, let us join our hands on common principles, on common values. This is what it says. In Surah number 60, Surah Al-Mumtahina, what does Allah say? Allah says, Allah does not forbid you from having good relations with those who do not fight you in the matters of your religion, do not expel you from your homes. Be nice to them.
Judaism and Christianity and Islam share some of the same moral values: respect for the individual, the requirement to obey the divine will, to understand a sense of humility as being a human, non-perfect, a human to whom there is always a relationship with something that is greater and far beyond. These are things that all the religious traditions share with one another.
Islam emphasizes freedom. This Western society speaks a great deal about freedom. Freedom of expression, freedom of religion. The Quran says no compulsion in matters of religion.
God has permitted Muslim men to marry Christian and Jewish women who may or may not convert to Islam. The intimacy and love that God made between a Muslim husband and a Muslim wife can be no less when it is made between a Christian wife and a Muslim husband. Eating the foods of the people of the book is yet another indication in the bond for peacemaking. This day are all things good and pure made lawful unto you. The food of the people of the book is lawful unto you, and yours is lawful unto them. Lawful unto you in marriage are not only chaste women who are believers, but chaste women among the people of the book revealed before your time, when ye give them their due dowers, and desire chastity, not lewdness nor secret intrigues. Quran 5:5. We find in the Quran several chapters named after Christian and Jewish figures: Yusuf or Joseph, Mary, Ali Imran, the family of Mary, Ibrahim for Prophet Abraham, the table, referring to the table of Jesus offering food, the room for the Roman Empire are examples. The chapter of Rome expresses Muslim condolences over the defeat of Christians by the disbelievers and giving the good tidings that they will later be victorious. We find in the Quran many inspiring stories about the prophets Jesus, Moses, Abraham, John the Baptist, Jacob, Joseph, and many more. Muslims are inspired by the teachings of these holy prophets, much the same as their inspiration from the Prophet Muhammad. God's omnipotence and might is reflected in miracles such as Virgin Mary giving birth to Jesus. The Quran tells us about the exchange that takes place between Mary and the angel who announced the forthcoming birth of Jesus to her. Said she, "O my sustainer, how can I have a son when no man has ever touched me?" The angel answered, "Thus it is. God creates what He wills. When He wills a thing to be, He but says unto it, Be, and it is." Quran 3:47. The angel also tells Mary, "And He will impart unto thy son revelation, and wisdom, and the Torah, and the gospel, and will make him an apostle unto the children of Israel." Quran 3:48 and 49.
Jesus is a very important figure in the Quran. A number of passages speak about Jesus. Jesus is mentioned a number of times in the Quran. There's some very interesting similarities between Muslims and Christians. For example, if we look at the figure of Jesus. In the Quran, Muslims understand that Jesus is not just a prophet of God, but someone who has a miraculous birth. The Quran speaks of Jesus being born of Mary, who is a virgin. And so Muslims, like Christians, believe that the virgin birth, that Jesus is born from Mary, who is a virgin. The Quran tells us that Jesus receives the Gospels, and the word that the Quran uses, Injil, Moses is the prophet that's mentioned most by name in the Quran. If you look at the number of prophets that the Quran mentions, it's Moses who's mentioned the most. And for the most part, it's a very similar story to the story in the Hebrew Bible. In the Quran, and for Muslims, Moses represents really the archetype of God's prophet against evil in the world, which is Pharaoh. And so that story, which is there in the Hebrew Bible as well, is a very important story for Muslims in the Quran, the story of Moses as the prophet speaking out against oppression. And the oppression is exemplified by Pharaoh. And so that struggle between the oppressed, the children of Israel, led by Moses, and the oppressor, Pharaoh, is a very important story for Muslims.
The Quraysh tribal campaign against the Muslims expanded to a new dimension in the form of economic and social boycotts. 8 years after Muhammad's first revelation, the Quraysh tribe imposed a boycott on the Prophet and his family and forced them out of Mecca to an arid and dry valley known as the Abu Talib Valley. The siege went on for 28 long months. During this time, the family of the Prophet was not allowed to deal, trade, buy, sell, or socialize with the Quraysh tribe. The siege took its toll on the Prophet and his family. As a result, they had to eat the grass, insects, roots, and shrubs. Due to the harsh conditions imposed on them, some of his family fell ill. The Prophet's wife, Khadijah, died as a result, shortly after the boycott was removed. Shortly after that, his uncle Abu Talib also died. Their deaths were a direct result to the long years of malnutrition and hardship in exile. King Negus of Abyssinia sent a Christian delegation of 33 people to visit the Prophet and express their concern about the Muslims' condition. This visit may have been one of the elements that led to the elimination of the sanctions. When the delegation visited the Prophet in his exile, they were overwhelmed by the Quran text he recited to them and by his profound wisdom. Quraysh tribal leaders, however, insulted the Christian delegation for showing concern and sympathy for the Muslims. The delegation abstained from replying to Quraysh's insult. For this occasion, Allah revealed these verses in Surah 28, verses 52 through 55, which read, "Those to whom we sent the book before this, they do believe in this revelation, and when it is recited to them, they say, 'We believed in it. Indeed, it is the truth from our Lord. Indeed, we have been Muslims bowing to God's will from before this. They will be given their reward twice for what they patiently endured, and because they avert evil with good, and from what we have provided them, they spend. And when they hear ill speech, they turn away from it and say, 'To us our deeds, and to you yours.'" Quran 28:52 through 55. The visit by the Abyssinian delegates exposed the inhumane treatment the Quraysh tribal leaders imposed on some of their people that they disagreed with. This visit may have awoken the conscience of a few of the Quraysh leaders, who agreed amongst themselves to stop the fool act of the boycott, and planned to call the rest of the people of Quraysh and its leaders into a public meeting at the Kaaba for the purpose of ending the banishment. As a result of this meeting, the ban was removed. The visit of the Christian delegation was indeed a good example of the genuine meaning of faith. Having lost his wife and uncle, Muhammad's exposure to Quraysh's harassment and assaults grew greater. In old Arabia, the governing law was that everyone is protected by belonging to a clan. The stronger the clan, the better the protection. For Muhammad, his father died before he was born, and his mother died when he was 6 years old. His guardianship moved to his grandfather at first. Then, when his grandfather died, it moved on to his uncle Abu Talib. Now that he lost his uncle and wife, he lost most of the protection of his clan. Being tired of Quraysh's assaults and rejection, Muhammad started looking for another chance for his cause outside of Mecca. The Prophet made a decision to go to Al-Taif, 150 kilometers south of Mecca, in the hope of finding a stronger collaboration from its people. It must have been horribly painful for Muhammad to have made such a decision. He knew that if he left the city, his life would be endangered by the lawless Arabia, and that if he had to return to Mecca, he would have to find a new clan to protect him, which might not be possible. In Al-Taif, the Prophet was utterly turned down by the city's 3 leaders. One leader said to him, "If God sent you, I will tear down the hangings of the Kaaba." The second leader told him, "Couldn't God find anyone else other than you to send?" The third leader refused to meet with the Prophet, but sent his servant with this message, "I do not need to speak to you. For if you are a messenger from God as you claim, then you are too great of a person for me to address. And if you are a liar, it is not befitting for me to speak to you." Knowing the consequences if he returned to Mecca, Muhammad appealed to them to conceal the news of rejection from Quraysh, or to allow him to stay among them. His plea was also rejected. Instead of the expected kindness, they turned loose their children to follow him and threw stones at him until his head was severely cut. He bled until the blood came out of his shoes. Just outside of town in a vineyard, the Prophet and his servant rested and prayed these words, "O my God, unto you I complain of my weakness, of my helplessness, and of my lowliness before men. O most merciful of the merciful, you are Lord of the weak, and you are my Lord. Into whose hands will you entrust me? Unto some far-off stranger who will ill-treat me? Or unto a foe whom you have empowered against me? I care not if your wrath is not on me." Upon this supplication, the angel of mountains came to the service of Prophet Muhammad, asking his permission to close the mountains on the people of Taif. But despite his deepest wounds of rejection, Muhammad replied, "No, God may bring from their offspring people who may testify to the oneness of God and worship Him." The Prophet was magnanimous. His zeal for peace and forgiveness indeed overpowered his personal anger and self-wounds. Testifying to this fact, God revealed, "And indeed you are of a great moral character." Quran 68:4. The Quran also said, "And we have not sent you, O Muhammad, but as a mercy to the worlds." Quran 21:107. Now, Muhammad had no other choice but bear the pain of rejection and humiliation and return to Mecca. The next task for him was to find protection in Mecca. He sent his servant Zayd with the names of several tribal leaders in the hope that one of them would accept the request. Only one, Al-Muti ibn Adi, who was an idolater, accepted the protection of the Prophet. For the next 3 years, Muhammad was under the protection of a disbeliever. As expected from the Prophet, who was sent to teach wisdom and rationality, he had to deal with the new circumstance differently. Now he would no longer speak low of their idols, nor would he introduce himself to Quraysh in the way and frequency he used to. Instead, he channeled his efforts to the people who visit Mecca, especially during the pilgrimage season. And this flexibility in approach seemed to be fruitful. For example, he met with some people from the city of Yathrib who were favorable to his call and accepted Islam. The few converted Yathrib Muslims went back to their people and made more converts. In the next pilgrimage season, 12 of them met secretly with the Prophet and made a covenant with him to act and live up to the highest of standards. He asked his companion, Musab ibn Umair, to go with them and be his ambassador in Yathrib. In Yathrib, the Prophet's ambassador and the 12 Yathrib Muslims were successful in introducing Islam in the city. In the next year's pilgrimage to Mecca, 70 Yathrib Muslims met again, secretly with the Prophet, and made a pact with him to live righteously and give him protection. The prophet had them select 12 representatives from amongst themselves, possibly reflecting their corresponding tribes, to report to Musab. Under this leadership, the Yathrib Muslim community soon became a significant power. Now, the scale of the relative power between the Quraysh tribe and the Muslims had begun to shift in favor of the Muslims. 11 years after the first revelation, the miraculous journey of the prophet to Jerusalem and his ascension to the seven heavens took place. In this remarkable journey, Muhammad met with his brother prophets, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and all other prophets sent by God, and he led them in a prayer in Jerusalem. From Jerusalem, he ascended to the seven heavens, again meeting with the prophets. It was here he received the Muslim duties of the 5 daily prayers. Muhammad's meetings with all the prophets demonstrates the close ties and common grounds between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, as well as other revealed religions. Since the conditions for the Muslims in Yathrib was far better than that of Mecca, most Meccan Muslims migrated to Yathrib to escape rejection and execution. They left behind their loved ones and belongings. Late in the 12th year, from the first revelation, the prophet himself received inspiration to migrate to Yathrib. He instructed his close friend, Abu Bakr, to prepare 2 camels, food and supplies, and set them on standby for the journey. The prophet also hired a travel guide for his convoy. Observing the Muslims' migration and success in Yathrib, Quraysh leaders were getting nervous and furious. Out of other options, they resorted to use more violence and plotted to kill Muhammad without the fear of reprisal from his clan, the Banu Hashim. The plot to kill Muhammad was to be carried out by a representative from each of Quraysh's clans, with each plunging his sword into him. In this way, the prophet's clan would not be able to fight all of the clans of the Quraysh combined. The prophet was informed by Allah of Quraysh's plan and gave Muhammad the permission to migrate to Yathrib. The prophet told his close friend Abu Bakr, who was all too happy to accompany the prophet in his journey. On the night of the journey, the prophet instructed Asma, Abu Bakr's daughter, along with her brother Abdullah, to deliver food and the news of Quraysh's plan to his hideout at Cave Thawr. He also instructed Abu Bakr's servant to graze a herd of sheep where the prophet's convoy and messengers walk, to destroy their footprints. This helped prevent Quraysh's assassins from tracing their footprints to their hideout. On the night the murderers surrounded the prophet's house, Ali ibn Abi Talib, the prophet's cousin, offered to wrap himself in the prophet's cloak and lay in his bed, knowing that Quraysh will not harm him. The prophet made his escape from Mecca along with Abu Bakr. To mislead the Meccans, who believed he would head north to join the rest of the Muslims in Yathrib, Muhammad and Abu Bakr headed south instead, to their hideout, the Cave Thawr. When the murderers entered Muhammad's house to kill him, they were disappointed to find out that it was Muhammad's cousin who was in the bed. The leaders of Mecca called for a wide search for Muhammad and offered 100 camels as a reward to the one who apprehended him. This lucrative reward attracted many people to search for Muhammad. Because of his well-devised plan, no one was able to find him. The prophet and his friends stayed in the cave for 3 days. During the nights, they were kept informed of all news and developments of what was occurring in Mecca. After 3 days, the prophet, Abu Bakr, and their guide took the Red Sea route to Yathrib to ensure their escape. After 10 days' journey, Muhammad arrived safely in Yathrib. That day in mid-June, 622 AD, marked the beginning of the Islamic calendar and the founding of the Muslim nation. Muhammad was well received in Yathrib, and the people named their city Madinatu an-Nabi, the city of the prophet, or Medina for short. Not long after his arrival, the prophet built the first mosque from which he began delivering his messages. Along with this spiritual development, the prophet made other social and political developments in the city. These developments served to establish peace and strengthen the bonds amongst the people in the city. He established a peace between two major tribes in the city. He also established a transitional league of brotherhood between the Meccan emigrants and the Medinan Muslims. With the 13 Jewish tribes living in Medina, he forged a treaty called the Constitution of Medina, which ensured everyone's freedom and safety, people's political rights, freedom of belief, freedom of enterprise and trade were protected. Also, this constitutional document spelled out individual citizen obligations, sanctity of life, prevention of crime, laws of municipalities, and the dignity and equality of people governed under the law.
Prophet Muhammad established a charter or a constitution which clearly established the rights and the duties of non-Muslims, and in particular Jews and Christians within the community. And there was an alliance.
There were alliances between Muslims and Christians and alliances between Muslims and Jews. Therefore, the idea that we are all descended from the same Abrahamic religion holds true.
The Constitution of Medina really demonstrated the extent to which Medina was not simply a Muslim city or a Muslim community. And that in fact Medina was to be a community that incorporated people of other faiths.
Here in Medina, the Prophet was reaching out to the Jews. He was teaching the Muslims and Jews who attended his sermons what was revealed to him from the stories of Moses, Jesus, and other Israelite prophets. Also, the Muslims were told to face Jerusalem in their prayers, like the Jews and Christians did.
As we also know, early on, the Prophet expected that Jews would, in time, accept the message of Islam. And indeed, the early Muslims faced Jerusalem initially. However, when it became clear that that acceptance wasn't going to come, the Quran revealed to Muhammad that the direction of prayer be changed to Mecca.
Regarding Muhammad's grand work in Medina in establishing law and order, Karen Armstrong, in her book, Muhammad, A Biography of the Prophet, stated, "Unlike Christianity, which came to birth under the Roman Empire, where the social and political orders were already established, and Jesus and St. Paul had to mainly worry about the spiritual order, Arabia had no political or social order. Under this constitution, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in peace and harmony. It also gave protection to the Jews and Christians who were minorities in the Muslim lands."
The Golden Age, particularly in Spain in the medieval period, is a flourishing time, particularly of Jewish and Muslim collaboration. When Jews were able to live and prosper and contribute to the general society when they were a minority living under Islamic regimes.
As the new immigrants arrived into Medina, many of them fell ill, having no immunity against the kind of diseases existing there. The Prophet formed a task force and asked them to remove the city's wastes from its streets to a trash dump area called Al-Jufa. He made this prayer, "O Allah, purify Medina and help us move its disposable to Al-Jufa, and cure our sick and make us love it in the same way you made us love Mecca." As a result of this work, a healthier environment for all the citizens was achieved. Another urban task Muslims conducted was improving the water and irrigation systems in Medina. The Prophet, along with the city's water drilling experts, drew up plans for drilling 54 water wells in and around the city. Upon its completion, water for the city and for irrigation was plentiful. The Prophet issued land deeds for improvements to dead land. He said, "Any who improves a dead land, he will have the right to own it." As a result of this work, the agriculture of the city grew and prospered. The third task the Prophet undertook was to light the city streets. Tamim bin al-Aus ad-Dari had set lamps in the mosque of the Prophet to illuminate it. When the Prophet entered the mosque, he was pleased with what he saw. He asked Tamim to provide lamps for all the city streets in Medina. Upon the completion of this job, the Prophet said, "May Allah enlighten the heart of Tamim ad-Dari, for if I had a daughter, I would have asked her to marry him. From that point on, the city's name took an adjective to become Al-Madina al-Munawwara, or the Enlightened City. The spiritual, political, civic, and social developments of the city should help in understanding why Muslims do not separate religion and state. The question of separation between religion and state relevant to Islam is addressed by Karen Armstrong in her book, Muhammad, A Biography of the Prophet. She states, "In Europe, we have gradually evolved an ideal which separates church and state, and we usually blame Islam for confusing two areas that are essentially distinct. But the Christian experience should not prejudice us against other cultural and religious traditions, which have developed under different conditions." Muslims escaped Mecca before facing extinction, but they would continue to be in mortal danger for the next 5 years in Medina.
The Meccans were, in fact, persecuting the Muslims not only when the Muslims were living in Mecca, but then they still were trying at the end of the day to enjoy their pride of place and to, in many ways, marginalize the Medinan community.
Islam is a religion of peace, and Muhammad, the Prophet, he tolerated a lot of persecution, abuse, and suffered a lot at the hands of his enemies, and did not want to shed blood or go to war. And God had to tell him to fight those who persecute you.
The Prophet had to migrate, leave Mecca and come to Medina. They did not leave him alone there. They kept coming and attacking the city of Medina, one after another.
In Muhammad, A Biography of the Prophet, Karen Armstrong states, "It was essential that Muslims display an image of strength and decisiveness if they were to survive the lawless state of Arabia 7th century. In Medina, whenever the Prophet heard that one tribe, urged by Mecca propaganda, was preparing to invade Medinan territory, he would march aggressively to forestall the attack, and the opposition tended to melt away as soon as the Muslims arrived."
And so we see a series of battles. In the Battle of Badr, against overwhelming odds, the Muslims win. In the Battle of Uhud, the situation's reversed, and indeed the Prophet is injured.
The story of the Battle of the Pact began with the Meccan Quraysh leaders summoning all its confederates, 10,000 people, and marched towards Medina with the intention of finishing off the Muslims. This was a year after the Battle of Uhud. The battle ended peacefully without an actual fight because the Muslims dug a deep ditch between the flatland of Medina and the mountains outside the city. They strategically placed their soldiers on the mountainous side and along this ditch. The Meccans were taken by surprise when they were faced by the ditch and were unable to cross it or penetrate the Muslim defensive lines. After 40 days of siege and attempts to engage the Muslims in a battle, Quraysh soldiers gave up and returned home. Muslims believed their struggle, or jihad, paid off in preventing another bloodbath and a major loss of life.
War has to be avoided as much as possible. For this reason, Islam said that you should be strong. If you are strong, your enemies will not attack you. There will be no war.
Muhammad sent several expeditions to the rest of the tribal communities of Arabia, announcing their strong presence and making alliances with them before Quraysh did. Although these early battles made a significant psychological outcome, the resulting casualties were quite small. With all three battles combined, casualties from both sides were less than 200 people. While Islam's beginnings were full of troubling times, battles, and hardship, at no time did Muhammad seek to compel followers to the new religion. To Muslims, there is no compulsion in matters of faith.
Islam absolutely forbids compelling people, coercing people to accept Islam. La ikraha fid din. Very categorical statement. There is no compulsion allowed in matters of religion. In many other places, the Quran says you cannot compel people to accept the faith. So only convey. In the countries where Islam is spread, you still have Christian groups, Jewish groups, Zoroastrian groups, people of many other faiths.
Between the battles for self-preservation against the Quraysh tribes, the way Islam spread throughout history, or some of the more recent events in the world, the Quran is one of the most misinterpreted books of any religion.
To interpret the Quran, you need a number of things. First of all, you need a very thorough command of the Arabic language, that for Muslims, the Quran is revealed in Arabic. And just linguistically, understanding the language becomes so important. Then understanding the context. How did this verse or how did that verse come to be revealed? What was the context in which these verses were revealed? How do these fit into Islamic history and interpretation? It's not that you can interpret the verses totally different from how other people have done that. You're free to interpret the verses, but you're bound by the fact that these really are God's words for all people in all times.
Because Quran is a universal document, it is for all time, for all places, for all people, but it certainly came at a particular time, to a particular person, in a particular language, in particular circumstances.
Each text that talks about fighting and violence has to be seen in terms of when was that revealed, in what context did it appear. And therefore, for example, one may see a passage like slay the unbelievers wherever you find them. Okay. But often, number one, that passage is quoted out of context, and often only the first part of the passage is quoted. In most of these passages, the verse then goes on to say, but should they stop fighting? When they stop fighting, then remember that God is compassionate. One has to stop fighting. And so many of these passages are dealing with instances in which the community is under siege and the community is being told to fight and to fight back, and that the community has the right and duty to do that. But the other thing that's interesting is that at times when it says slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, the unbelievers being referred to are the Meccans.
The word jihad denotes physical, moral, spiritual, and intellectual efforts exerted for a particular goal.
The very term jihad in Arabic means to strive, to struggle, to exert oneself in the path of God. Jihad fi sabil Allah, struggling in the path of God. Its primary meaning in the Quran means the struggle to realize God's will. A Muslim is one who submits, one who follows God's will. And so in many ways, it indicates what every believer has to do. Every believer, whether Muslim, Jew, Christian, etc., struggles in this world to be good, to be moral, to live up to one's faith. And that's the primary meaning of jihad.
The Quran teaches that war and bloodshed is always abominable. Diplomacy and reconciliation are divine mechanisms to restoring peace, security, and hope.
Violence is to be avoided as much as possible. It is something which is evil, which is bad.
When the Muslim state was strong enough to defend themselves and were no longer afraid for their lives, they pursued reconciliation with the Meccans. For example, during the 6th year from his migration to Medina, the Prophet, with 1,400 people, peacefully moved toward Mecca to conduct the ritual of the Lesser Pilgrimage. The Quraysh leaders, however, sent 50 horsemen to block the main route of the pilgrims and to attack the Muslims as they approached. Even though the Muslims were many folds greater in number and could have attained an easy victory, the Prophet took a different route through the narrow and rocky canyons that were extremely difficult to cross in order to reach Mecca. When the Muslims realized they would not be allowed to perform their ritual, they negotiated with Quraysh a resolution for peace known as the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The treaty, among other things, called for no war for the next 10 years, and that the Meccans are to allow the Muslims to perform the Lesser Pilgrimage in the following season. Many of Muhammad's companions were dissatisfied and angry and felt it was humiliating to sign such a treaty. Karen Armstrong, in her book, A Biography of the Prophet, stated, Muhammad was a peacemaker who risked his life and nearly lost the loyalty of his closer companions because he was so determined to reconcile with Mecca. Instead of fighting an intransient war to the death, Muhammad was prepared to negotiate and to compromise. And this apparent humiliation proved, in the words of the Quran, to be a great victory.
The Prophet was in an area of Arabia in which you had tribal warfare. And Arabia was located between two massive empires, the Sassanid and the Eastern Byzantine Empire, who were themselves warring among themselves. The Prophet brought peace to Arabia. He brought Islam, and Islam, submission to the will of God, the religion of Islam was to transcend all tribal and ethnic affiliations. And so he brought peace to Arabia.
Islam absolutely forbids attacking people who are innocent. Islam says you should not initiate violence. The Quran says do not aggress against those who do not aggress against you. So even if there is difficulties and problems, try to see that the Quran says that when people do wrong to you, you should do good to them, so that this is the way you can bring friendship and good relation.
The Prophet's wisdom in making peace and uniting his people did not stop at only political treaties, but he used the social customs of Arabia to overcome factions and animosity in the land. Who he married is an example of this. The Prophet married Hubayba, the daughter of the Quraysh leader Abu Sufyan. Later he married a Jewish lady, Sufiya, the daughter of the chief of the Nudair tribe. The Prophet also married a Christian lady, Maria. Even though both these ladies accepted Islam, these marriages are symbols showing that Islam transcends barriers. It also shows that Islam seeks to build bridges and relationships with other communities and other religions.
The Prophet in his own personal life often sought to bring about that peace through diplomacy, and indeed through a number of his marriages. So when we look at the marriages of the Prophet, they occur for a number of reasons. He married widows, but the Prophet also was involved in marriages, much as later on we see rulers involved in marriages that cement relationships with other tribes.
A chronological timeline of the marriages of the Prophet reveals the role of these marriages to bring about peace. The Prophet married his first wife, Khadijah, at age 25. She was a widow of age 40. They stayed married until she died. He was then 50 years old. He stayed single for the next 3 years until the age of 53, when in Medina the Prophet married his second wife, Aisha. In the next several years, during the reconciliation with Quraysh and the tribes surrounding Medina, he made the rest of his other marriages. These marriages were instrumental in ending the violence and securing lasting peace. The Prophet used other social customs to create peace and friendship.
When the Prophet was in Medina, he noticed Jews fasting on a particular day, and he asked them, why do you fast on this day? And they explained to him that this was the day in which God had saved Moses. And so for the Prophet Muhammad, the idea was that this was just as important a day for Muslims as it was for Jews. And so the Prophet Muhammad fasted on that day too. In the Islamic calendar, it's the 10th day of the month of Muharram, the day of Ashura. And so Muslims still fast on that day, similar to the Jewish understanding of fasting.
Muhammad encouraged Muslims to create social bonds through their work within their communities. In his young age, before he received the message of Islam, Prophet Muhammad, along with his uncles, attended a meeting of a social organization called the Alliance of Virtue. This organization was established to help the oppressed and to foster justice in and around Mecca. After receiving the revelation, the Prophet showed his esteem with such organizations and said, "I had witnessed, along with my uncles, a meeting of the Alliance of Virtue in the house of Abdullah ibn Judan, whom I loved more than the most precious thing, and if I were to be called to join it in Islam, I would." Muslims believe in fostering good traits and condemn evil acts. In fact, one of the lesser pillars of a Muslim is fostering good and forbidding bad. This is known as Al-Amir bil Ma'ruf wa Anahi an al-Munkar, meaning commanding the doing of what is right and forbidding what is wrong. This philosophy allows the Muslim to practice what is known by all people to be good, such as obeying traffic laws, penalizing the criminal, stating the truth, etc., and also rejects what is known as bad or immoral, such as intoxication, harming neighbors, stealing, and lying.
Some scholars say ma'ruf is that which is recognized by all people as good, and munkar is that which is recognized by all people as bad.
Islam by now has a strong footing in Arabia, and the Muslims enjoyed the peaceful years after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah was signed. However, this peace would not last. 2 years after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah was enacted, one of the Quraysh tribes breached it, attacking and killing 20 people from a tribe from the Muslims' camp.
The treaty is basically, at a certain point, seen as violated by the Meccans, who undertake a series of attacks or getting others to attack the Medinan community. And so, in effect, the Prophet says this is abrogated. The Medinan community moves on Mecca, and at the end of the day, the Meccans, realizing that they are facing a highly motivated community, and in a sense, overwhelming odds, are subdued, surrender.
The Prophet moved into Mecca with as many as 10,000 people and entered the city peacefully. He entered the city with his head bowed down in humility to God and with respect for the city's sacred house of God. He forgave the Meccans with his famous words, "Go about wherever you may please, for you are set free." Muhammad's action in forgiving the Meccans was magnanimous, since Muhammad was at the peak of his power and he could have easily crushed the Meccans. In contrast, the Meccans, at the peak of their power, executed the Muslims, who were weak and defenseless.
The genius of the Prophet here as a leader is very interesting, because he does not choose to do what many at that time might have chosen to do, and that is to simply subdue and slaughter in a way to get revenge, to retaliate and get back. But rather he takes the high ground. The Prophet accepts the surrender. A fairly significant number of notables convert to Islam, and the Prophet indeed offers positions of significance to a number of the Meccans. And so in many ways, the Meccans now become absorbed within that broader Islamic community.
During the Muslims' peaceful re-entry into Mecca, the Prophet announced, "Anyone who enters the house of Abu Sufyan, who is the leader of the Meccans, is safe." Here, we see that the Prophet was acknowledging the stature of the leaders of Mecca, and he showed that the Muslims were not to abuse the social and political structure of the society. Once the city was opened, Muhammad appointed Attab ibn Asid, a member of the Quraysh tribe, to rule the city, rather than placing himself or his regime to rule over Mecca. God emphasizes in the Quran the sacredness of the human soul and condemns acts of terror. If anyone slays a human soul, unless it be in punishment for murder or for spreading corruption on earth, it shall be as though he had slain all mankind. Whereas, if anyone saves a life, it shall be as though he had saved the lives of all mankind. Quran 5:32. Muslims believe that any regulation or act made for saving a human life, such as traffic regulations, medicinal child-proof bottling, and the protection of the ecological system, are examples for saving the human life. A Muslim is rewarded for inventing and practicing such measures and showing respect for the human soul. The Islamic law, Sharia, is a community moral law derived from the Quran and the teachings of Prophet Muhammad.
The Sharia is not just a legal system. It's an orientation towards God. Literally, Sharia means the path to the watering hole, which means that by taking certain actions, we can come closer to the source of divine goodness and justice. So that includes not only creating laws in society like criminal laws and contract laws, but also forming our family life, our community life, looking at our relationship with our neighbors. One interesting thing about Islamic law is that Muslims have moral and legal obligations to their neighbors. It's impermissible for a Muslim to go to sleep while his or her neighbor is hungry. Your neighbor in Islamic law has a right to come and demand, in fact, food from you if they're in need. So that idea that the legal system is a way to create a sense of community, a sense of responsibility, beyond the individual, although of course individual rights are also protected.
The Sharia is built around the protection of 5 vital elements.
There are 5 important things in Islam that must be very strictly protected. The blood of the people, the life of the people, their property, their religion, their honor, which is related to family, related to themselves, no defamation, no gossip, no spread of rumors against somebody, all of these things. And then people's mind, through their understanding, their knowledge, all of these things, that has to be protected.
Muslims believe that the severity of punishment for certain crimes in the Islamic law is for deterrent purposes.
The Quran says that in the punishments of retribution, that there is life for people, meaning that some crimes, if they become widespread in a society, can cause great damage. Not only can individuals be harmed, but people will feel insecure. They won't be able to live a normal life in society.
It has been proven that people are less likely to commit unlawful violations so long as the penalty is stiff. For example, in California, a traffic citation point in 2004 requires 18 months to be removed off a violator's record, versus 6 months requirement in the mid-1970s. Similarly, the level of intoxicant found in a drunk driving citation was lowered to 0.08 in the early part of 2000 from 0.12 in the mid-1970s. To Muslims, avoiding punishment is part of the judicial system. The Prophet teaches jurists
to avoid the punishment by any suspicions.
The Islamic law also offers an alternative for capital punishment by means of pardon or monetary compensation.
If someone commits a deliberate act of murder in an Islamic legal system, the family of the victim has the right to forgive that person. They also have the right to demand punishment, or they can ask for compensation. And the Quran states that it's preferable for the people to forgive. Why is that? Because forgiveness itself is an act it frees the people who have been harmed from a sense of anger, a sense of victimization. It empowers them to have some control over the situation by giving that act of forgiveness.
The Quran emphasizes peaceful dialogue. Invite all to the way of your Lord with wisdom and beautiful preaching, and discuss with them in ways that are the best and most gracious. Quran 16:125. Say, O people of the book, come to common terms as between you and us, that we worship none but God, that we associate no partners with him, that we erect not from among ourselves lords and patrons other than God. If then they turn back, say, bear witness that we are at least Muslims, bowing to God's will. Quran 364.
A delegation from Najran, which is a city in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, came all the way to meet with the Prophet and to explore his idea and his belief about Jesus Christ and Christianity. They would come and enter the city of Medina, and there the Prophet would receive them in his own mosque, the place of worship, and he will give them permission to offer their prayers in their own way, and then he will sit with them and speak to them and dialogue with them, and this lasts for 3 days.
At the end of the visit, the Christian delegation declined the Prophet's invitation to accept Islam. The Prophet accepted their decision and gave them a letter assuring their freedom of worship and safety. Here is a part of his letter. Najran is under the protection of God and his Prophet. Najran's homes, churches, monks, priests, and their present and absent and alliance shall be safe.
We have numerous examples of not only the Prophet, but his successors, the caliphs who came after him. They would talk and dialogue and sit in long sessions of discussion with the non-Muslims, with Jews and Christians.
Muslims believe in the fraternity of all people. God said, "O humankind, we created you from a single pair of a male and female, and made you into nations and tribes, that you may know and deal with each other in kindness, not that you may despise each other. Verily, the most honored of you in the sight of God is the most righteous of you, and God is knower, aware." Quran 49:13.
Some people still want to believe that Islam is a threat to the West, and that Islam is a religion that promotes violence or teaches violence. This is far from the truth. Islam, the very word, comes from peace, the word meaning peace, and Islam is a religion of peace. Muhammad the Prophet embraced Christians, he embraced Jews. Jews and Christians lived among Muslims and under Muslim authority, and had the freedom to practice their religion and conduct their affairs as they did before Islam.
If there is communication and understanding, then there is friendship, collaboration, and bridge building.
If dialogue between Christians and Jews was the mandatory work after the Holocaust, dialogue between Jews and Christians and Muslims is the mandatory work in our own day and time. My own Christian tradition says, treat your enemy with respect and love, and turn your enemy into your friend. There's a table where we can sit down and talk long before we have to get to acts of desperation.
We are all our brother's keepers. We all must love our neighbors. And we have an ethical obligation not to destroy one another.
For 70 years, Muslims and Christians performed their rituals and prayers side by side before the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, Syria, was expanded in 705. Caliph Al-Walid ibn Abdul Malik bought the St. Baptist Church, which was east of the mosque, from the Christians in exchange for 4 other churches in the city. Today, the tomb of John the Baptist stands in the center of the Umayyad Mosque, along with the original baptismal well and stone-made pot. One of its minarets is known as the Minaret of Jesus. Muslims believe that Prophet Jesus will be returning to earth and will start his mission from this holy place. Muslims are then supposed to follow him as well as Christians. In an effort to bridge between Muslims and Christians, Sheikh Ahmad Kuftaro had called on both Muslims and Christians to work together, paving the road for his return. History shows that when Muslims and Christians clashed, they discovered that they share much of the same values. The Crusaders and Saladin is an example. In the book Saladin in His Time, P.H. Nupi stated, "The Crusaders were fascinated by a Muslim leader who possessed virtues they assumed were Christian." Saladin's image was in the Millennium issue of Time magazine. Time magazine wrote about Dante's Divine Comedy and said, "But perhaps what should be most surprising in his catalog of great-hearted souls was a figure solitary, set apart. That figure was Saladin." When Dante, the most Christ-centered verse ever penned, wrote lionizing his name, Saladin had been dead for over 100 years. Dante's writings stand today, as it did in the past, as a testament to Saladin's extraordinary stature. When Saladin captured Jerusalem from the Franks, he spared the lives of 100,000 Christians. Richard the Lionheart negotiated peace with Saladin. Saladin could have exploited the situation since he had the upper hand. However, he followed Islam's quest for peace and spared their lives. God said, "It may be that God will grant love and friendship between you and those whom you hold as enemies. For God has power over all things, and God is oft forgiving, most merciful." Quran 60:7. In contrast, when the Crusaders entered the city 88 years earlier, they massacred 80,000 of the original inhabitants of the city. Among the slaughtered were Christians and Jews.
Salahuddin, or Saladin, I think is a very important figure to look at in Islam. Why? Because, a lot of times when we talk about religion, people will say, yeah, but you're talking about abstract thought, or you're talking about a set of beliefs. But how did Muslims actually act? Just as we can say, how did Christians actually act? And regrettably, we can go back and pick out, and there are, the negative images, the negative people, the negative examples. But we also have the great leaders, the enlightened leaders. And Saladin represents that kind of enlightenment. When we look at the way in which the Muslims were viewed, those who were following this Muslim ruler, by even the Christian army and by the head of the Christian army, he was very well respected in his own time. Not only is a great warrior, but a man with a great sense of chivalry and moral code. And indeed, when the Muslims were victorious, he did not do what many at that time would have done, and that is, slaughter the soldiers, slaughter the women and children, but in fact spared those who were conquered.
In September 1192, during the siege of Acre, King Richard the Lionheart gained a lasting respect for Saladin. When Richard fell sick, Saladin sent him his own physician, Ibn Maymun, the Maimonides, to treat him. Along with this health care, he frequently sent him ice to cool down his fever and plum fruits that were necessary for his recovery. Saladin went beyond justice in helping Christian women find their husbands. He ordered his soldiers to search for their missing ones. Those whose husbands or guardians were determined dead, Saladin ordered they receive compensation in currency from the treasury as if they were killed, not as soldiers of war, but by error or accident. During the siege of Acre, several soldiers were captured. Among them was an old man who was so old that he was toothless and could hardly walk. Saladin questioned him as to why he was there. The old man said that he had no thought but to make a pilgrimage to the Church of the Resurrection in Jerusalem. Saladin was so touched by his answer and condition that he ordered that the old man be escorted to Jerusalem to fulfill his worship dream. Saladin entered the annals of Western history as a magnanimous and respected figure. Saladin's chivalry and high standards were at the soul of the plays and romances created by Sir Walter Scott. The French historian René Grousset wrote this about Saladin's character. It is equally true that his generosity, his piety, devoid of fanaticism, that flower of liberality and courtesy which had been the model of our old chroniclers, won him no less popularity in Frankish Syria than in the lands of Islam. One thing that Islam brought which was revolutionary were rights to women. In the societies in much of Europe, Asia, and Africa, women's rights were non-existent until modern times. With the rise of Islam in the early 600s, the Arabian woman was recognized as equal partner to man. Islam had granted the woman a dignified role and established her right to inherit, marry, and divorce. Prophet Muhammad said, "Women are the partners of men."
In the days before the Prophet, men were really looking for virgins to marry. When a woman was married, she couldn't remarry. Once she had been divorced or once her husband had died, she was left unable to marry again.
Women were certainly second-class citizens. With the advent of Islam, Islam allowed women the right to inherit. It gave women the right to their own earnings, and it gave women the rights to accept a marriage, not have it imposed on them, and the right to request a divorce when they want it.
And if women are given the same rights as males or men to education, then no woman can be held back.
Whatever applies to a man applies to a woman in religious duties and in relationships.
A woman can be a doctor, a lawyer, she can have her own business, she can be an entrepreneur, she can work in a laboratory, she can do anything that any other woman can do.
The Quran names several chapters in honor of women. Al-Nisa, or the woman, is one chapter. or as the late Sheikh Ahmad Kuftaro taught, in defense of women. This chapter conveys many subjects regarding women's affairs and rights. Another chapter in the Quran devoted to women is named Al-Mujadila, or the woman with plea. In this chapter, Allah narrates the story of a woman who came to Prophet Muhammad complaining about her husband. The woman did not like the ruling of the Prophet in her case. She kept returning to the Prophet, arguing her case until a revelation in her behalf was revealed, changing the ruling of the Prophet in her favor. There is yet another chapter in the Quran named Mary, after the Virgin Mary, mother of Jesus. These chapters constitute a giant step in the liberation of women from the earlier beliefs of superstition. Men shall have a share of what their parents and kinsmen leave. Women shall have a share of what their parents and kinsmen leave. Whether it be little or much, it is legally theirs. Quran 4:7. Prophet Muhammad said, "Only a man of noble character will honor women, and only a low, vile man will dishonor them." Because of their role in home education and upbringing of children, Islam gives mothers greater honor than fathers. A man came to Prophet Muhammad and asked him, "O Messenger of God, who rightfully deserves the best treatment from me?" "Your mother," replied the Prophet. "Who is next?" asked the man. "Your mother," said the Prophet. "Who comes next?" the man asked again. "Your mother," replied the Prophet. "And who is after that?" insisted the man. "Your father," said the Prophet. Prophet Muhammad also said, "Heaven lies beneath the feet of mothers." Muslims believe obeying and serving mothers is a key to deserving paradise. God commands the obedience of parents. We have enjoined on man respect and kindness to his parents. In pain did his mother bear him, and in pain did she give him birth. Quran 46:15. Muslim women have risen to the highest government ranks. Salama, Prophet Muhammad's wife, advised the Prophet in important political and legislative matters. In the peaceful Treaty of Hudaybiyah, the Prophet acted upon her advice in making the treaty a reality. Mrs. Benazir Bhutto was the Prime Minister of Pakistan. Mrs. Megawati Sukarnoputri is the 5th President of Indonesia. Bangladesh had as its Prime Minister Mrs. Hasina Wajid, and the 2nd Vice President of Iran is Ibtikhar Masumi. While women should be responsible for raising the family, Islam teaches that the man should be responsible for the well-being of the family. These duties are based upon only on his physical ability of management and livelihood, not on superiority because he is a man. Women shall with justice have rights similar to those exercised against them, although men have a degree and responsibility above women. Allah is mighty and wise. Quran 2:228. Just like a pilot is responsible before the law for the safety of an airplane and the passengers, the man is given the responsibility of his family before God. Otherwise, both parents mutually share the management of the family, just like the pilot and co-pilot manage the aircraft in the air. Also, it takes hydrogen and oxygen to make a particle of water, but neither of the elements is superior to the other. The two elements only complement one another. Muslim women wear the scarf as a means of modesty. The scarf does not construe a limitation or incapacity with respect to her, nor does it make her inferior to man or other women. In the centuries before Islam, a man could have as many wives as he chose. Islam limited polygamy to 4 wives. To prescribe only 4 wives is a limitation, not a license. Unless the man is able to support and deal justly with all of his wives, he should remain monogamous. Many believe that polygamy is a means of social and financial assistance available for the unfortunate women. Similar to the financial assistance programs provided for single mothers by a particular state, Polygamy serves not only as a financial aid, but psychological and intimate as well. As well as the spiritual, social, and political contributions of Islam, Muslims believe that the quest for knowledge is an integral part of their faith. This philosophy opened the way for art and science that eventually led the way to the Renaissance.
Islam invented the book. It began with the word iqra, reading, using the pen. And so the Muslims became big converts to learning. And so not only were they doing the sciences, but they were doing a lot of literature. The Arabian Nights, the poetry of Omar Khayyam, for example, Romeo and Juliet is directly tied to the Romantic era. Cervantes' writings, Defoe's work, Robinson Crusoe has an Islamic origin. In terms of which sciences the Muslims invented, they invented all of the basic sciences according to Briffault, Goldstein, Durant, and others. That includes astronomy, physics, geometry, geography, geology, the science of algebra, we know that, also the science of trigonometry, and medicine, pharmacy are all Islamic productions.
Muslims believe contemplating the universe is a way to reach to God. The Quran points to signs on earth and heaven that make people think, investigate, and explore. Behold, God said, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, in the alteration of the night and the day, in the sailing of the ships through the ocean for the profit of mankind, in the rain which God sends down from the skies, and the life which He gives there to an earth that is dead, in the beasts of all kinds that He scatters through the earth, in the ordinance of the winds, and the clouds obedient between heaven and earth. These indeed are signs for people who have sense. Quran 2:164. Prophet Muhammad has said, seek knowledge, even if you have to go to China for it.
The Muslims actually went out, found knowledge in each culture, and brought it into a continuum.
Seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave, said the Prophet Muhammad. He also said, lo, the angels offer their wings to the seeker of knowledge.
The Hindu culture came in with the Persian, then with the Arabic, and then with the Greek and the European. It all bent together. The ancient pharaonic culture, all that knowledge came together. That led to the sciences. It was the Quran that leveled the playing field. That's the difference.
The Islamic philosophy of fraternity and learning for all opened the way for other religious minorities within the Islamic dynasty to grow and prosper.
In the early Umayyad period, we find that Christians and Jews were part of court life, that indeed they held responsible positions within the Umayyad court. And tradition also tells us that Christians and Muslims at times prayed together.
Muslims believe the Quran considers earthly issues important as well. The Quran named chapters after what constitutes the nerve of the economy in Arabia at the time of its revelation. The cattle is an example, or in modern terms, the cattle industry. Other names, such as the ore, or as the late Sheikh Ahmad Kuftaro translated as ore and mining, and Saba, in reference to the people of Yemen who built the Marib Dam for future agricultural and industrial projects.
You will see so many surahs named after the cosmos, named after the sun, the stars, the moon, the wind. A long chapter called the cattle, for the Muslim to study the benefit of the cattle.
Prophet Muhammad encouraged his followers not to be financially dependent on others, but to seek work and thrive. After all, he was a merchant himself. His inspirations in this regard are, poverty can be as bad as disbelieving in God. The Muslim who gives in charity is better than the one who receives charity. And he used to make this prayer, Our Lord, help us achieve prosperity in this life and in the hereafter.
Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, says, when the person dies, all of his actions will stop. except three things will continue after death. Number one, righteous son who prays for his father or his mother. Number two, a continuous charity. Number three, a useful knowledge.
The Muslims' day was highly dependent on time, since their prayers are at specific times during the day. As a direct act of faith, Muslims invented the clock.
There were clocks in the Persian Empire, in the ancient Greek Empire, and there were sundials. But in terms of a clock, the kind that we have today, that's Islamic. The pendulum was invented by Ibn Yunus in Egypt in the 12th century, who then regulated it for its use in clocks.
Caliph Harun al-Rashid sent a clock to the Charlemagne king of the Lombards, the Roman emperor, and through their friendship, an inn and a market for Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem was established. The Seljuk scientists, including Al-Qayyum, in the 11th and 12th century, were responsible for the creation of the solar calendar that was used widely until today. Muslim astronomers also devised a more popular calendar for the farmers, known in the West as the Calendar of the Cordoba, which served as the model for the modern Farmer's Almanac. In fact, the word almanac is from the Arabic word al-manakh, meaning the climate. This evidence reveals the influence of the Islamic world on the West in the keeping of time. Muslims founded the world's greatest trade route that spread from China and Central Asia to Baghdad, sometimes known to historians as the Golden Web. This was one of the most lucrative trade routes that existed during that time. It allowed gigantic trains of over 60,000 people and as many animals to travel on a regular basis from the great cities of China and Central Asia to Baghdad. From Baghdad, some of the goods would then be shipped on to other destinations, including Constantinople in Eastern Europe, Yemen, North Africa, and South Asia. The influence of Muslim trading was felt on the southern fringes of Europe along the Mediterranean Sea, in southern France, and on the coasts of Italy, Sicily, and North Africa. Never before Islam had so many people spread over a territory that made such a large range of products available to the consumer.
What Islam did was it opened up the trade routes, both the caravans and through shipping. Spices were traded, and it also opened up Europe. Europe was based on a bland diet and didn't know anything about any spices until its contact with the Muslims of Sicily, of the Boot of Italy, and of Spain. So they got a taste for ginger and cinnamon and nutmeg, and even some of the teas that have come through. They got the taste for citrus, which was grown in that area. They got the taste for exotic vegetables like spinach and artichokes and strawberries, and of course things like eggplant and so forth, melons, all came through Islamic trade with Europe. Coins are found in the tip of Scandinavia and in Iceland from the 9th century of Baghdad. That got there by shipping.
Islamic shipbuilding techniques were unparalleled anywhere in the world during that time.
The Muslims actually took the techniques that the Indians and the Chinese used and modified them. They created the first rudder. They created the lateen sail, modifying that to be a more productive sail. They created the first compass. The Chinese made the magnetic needle but didn't use it in navigation. The Muslims created it for navigation. Drugs were manufactured by the Muslims and shipped all the way to Scandinavia, all the way to South Africa, all the way to China. So they created an industry of drug manufacture.
To overcome the difficulties while traveling over the vast distances between cities and territories throughout the trade routes, not to mention the annual Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca, the natural course was for the invention of geography and map-making. Muslims excelled in geography in order to travel around natural barriers. Columbus's voyage was made up of navigators, sails, and maps that were of Islamic origin. The maps that were used were copies from Al-Idris's original maps. According to Sidelat, Al-Idrisi was a resident at the court of the Christian king Roger II of Sicily during the middle of the 12th century.
He was a highly dedicated scholar and wrote a huge encyclopedia. He was paid by King Roger the weight of his map in solid silver. Everything that Columbus did was 50% Islamic. So even until the 1500s, after the Americas were discovered, the European map industry was based on copying Ottoman maps and Islamic maps.
The lateen sail was taken by the Europeans and developed by the Spanish and Portuguese between 1440 and 1490. The word admiral came from the Arabic words Amir al-Bahar, or the Prince of the Sea. Similarly, the English word chemistry, sherbet, soda, coffee, jar, mirror, carrack, benzene, zero, monsoon, and genie all came from Arabic. The adventurous legends of the Arabian Nights, Aladdin, Sinbad the Sailor, and Ali Baba from the 7th to the 12th century are a direct reflection of the enormous culture of trade of the Golden Web and Islamic maritime. Because of the different money used in each region of the Golden Web and beyond, Muslims invented the check and the banking institutions in order to achieve a unified method of payment. The check is the most common tool of trade and commerce in the world today. The word check came from the Arabic word suq. A check would be issued in Baghdad for a particular commodity, and it would be cashed elsewhere in Indonesia, Yemen, India, or Europe. The development of partnerships and joint stock companies was another direct outcome of this financial invention of the check. Examples from the 9th and 10th centuries were the partnerships between the Muslims of Damascus, Syria, and Christian merchants of Italy. Ibn al-Haq in the Book of Roots and Kingdoms cited some private accounts in North Africa of an astonishing 400,000 dinars for precious metals exported from the Senegal.
Baghdad was known as the source of wisdom. Scholars, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, atheist, believer, they all came and converged on Baghdad to learn the sciences.
Muslims brought to Spain the concept of municipal administration and measures of control of commerce. Today, we find many English words reflecting the economic and commerce influence of Islam on Europe. The most influential ones include traffic, from tafriq, meaning distribution, tariff, tarifa, or tax on commodities, magazine, from makhzan, to store, mankus, gauze, alcohol, algorithm, average, azimuth, caliber, and cipher, and others. The Greek method of acquiring scientific knowledge was mainly speculative. Science as such could make little headway. The Muslims, who were more realistic and practical in their approach, adopted the experimental method.
The scientific method was developed in the Islamic Empire in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries in detail by Islamic scientists and published in their books. They were the first to use deductive reasoning, the first to do precise scientific experiments, the originators of the original scientific textbooks, and they produced the first scientific, well-controlled trials, both in medicine, with animals and humans, and in physics and astronomy, as well as in other fields.
Some of the sciences developed by the Muslims were a direct result from the need of fulfilling their spiritual duties. Performing formal prayers, for example, Muslims face Kaaba, the house of worship built in Mecca by Prophet Abraham. This direction to Kaaba is called Qibla. Al-Biruni established longitudinal and latitudinal global lines for the Qibla in the 10th century. In order to find Qibla from any part of the globe, Muslims invented the compass and developed the sciences of geography and geometry. In 803 AD, Caliph Mamun's quest for knowledge led him to the opening of a special academy in Baghdad, the House of Wisdom. Its purpose was to translate the Greek documents into Arabic and further develop them into a science. He appointed a Christian, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, as the head of the academy.
Caliph Mamun used to pay the weight in gold of a book to be translated. If there was a good Greek book, a good Syriac book, it wasn't going to rot anymore in the monastery. The incentive was, if it's 50 pounds, you get 50 pounds of gold. Yeah, that turned some people on. And Christians and Jews and Muslims did the translations.
As well as the founding of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, Caliph al-Ma'mun commissioned a staff of astronomers to test the findings of Ptolemy, the ancient Greek astronomer. He built an observatory in Al-Mosul, Iraq. One of the observatory staff was Al-Farghani. In 830 AD, he published texts that served as the authority for astronomy in Europe and Asia for nearly 700 years. According to Gerard de Vaucouleurs in his book Discovery of the Universe, Al-Battani was a great astronomer and mathematician. He published an original Almagest and developed the science of trigonometry and introduced the sign. He also discovered the inequality in the moon's motion known as variation. He made new observations for the sun's position and improved the value of the tropical year, rectified Ptolemy's precession constant, and measured the obliquity of the ecliptic more accurately. Until the 12th century, Ibn Tufayl, Ibn Rushd, and Maimonides revolted against the Ptolemaic theory of homocentric model that the planets rotate around with the Earth as the center rather than the sun. Judd G.A. in the book History of Civilization regarded Al-Jabr ibn Hayyan as the father of chemistry. He discovered as many as 19 elements and is credited with correct measurements of specific weights in the periodic table for these elements. He perfected chemical processes such as distillation, crystallization, and sublimation. He was the first to distill vinegar into acetic acid. He introduced the relative solubility and insolubility of substance in solutions, and was the first to use glass tubes and bottles on a large scale. The famed physician Ar-Razi was also a chemist. He wrote the book Sir al-Asrar, The Secret of Secrets, which revealed much of the properties, colors, and types of minerals and mineralogy discovered by all previous civilizations. This book was the first example of a chemistry lab manual. The chemicals he experimented with included nitric and sulfuric acid. His laboratory included burners, water baths, a hearth, a kiln, bellows, filters, ceramic dishes, flasks, and vials. All these devices are part of the modern lab.
4 centuries later, in the 13th century, Roger Bacon translated The Secret of Secrets into Latin with the title Secretum Secretum. One of the greatest contributions to science Muslims made to the world is the creation of mathematical science. Algebra, geometry, algorithm, and arithmetic are at the heart of every scientific and social aspect of life.
Zero was used by the Hindu mathematicians for commerce, but not for algebra, not for surveying and for science. And it was the Muslims of the 9th century, Abul Wafa, Al-Khwarizmi, and others, who actually turned algebra into a science, added the zero, later on added decimals. They actually turned it into a science. The word algebra from Al-Jabr, the word arithmetic originates from Al-Khwarizmi, so does the word logarithm.
There is hardly a single device, business entity, industry, or architecture built without the Arabic numerals, the decimal point, the sine and cosine, the ruler, and the compass, all of which are Islamic inventions.
True, systematic, easy to understand geometry is partly Greek, partly Phoenician, partly Egyptian, but as a science, it's Islamic.
Ibn al-Haytham, who was also a physicist and astronomer, used his math genius for the development of optics. In his book, Book of Optics, he demonstrated the second law of refraction for the eyes and for the rainbow. He also described the functions of the eye, such as the connectives, iris, corona, and lens. He also shows the interrelation between the various parts.
What happened was Euclid had some idea of the physics of the eye, but he was in error. Galen was in error. Al-Haytham said, no, let me look at their theories, and he changed he did experiments. The experiments proved that Galen and Euclid were in error, and he created the first correct theory for binocular vision. the Greeks said that the eye shoots photons out. Al-Haytham of Egypt said no. The sun sends particles into the eye that gets transmitted into an image at the back of the brain. He was the inventor of optics, absolute.
Ibn al-Haytham and his student Kamalu ad-Din teamed up making history again when they first observed the basis for the modern camera, the obscura phenomenon. The obscura phenomenon, defined by Webster's dictionary as dark chamber, usually is a cardboard with a tiny pinhole. This was the foundation for the camera. Another branch of Arab learning was medicine. Hospitals and pharmacies were developed by Muslims in the 8th and 9th centuries. The first hospital ever built was in Baghdad in 706.
Wooten said that pharmacy was discovered and turned into a science by the Muslims of Spain, by the Muslims of Baghdad. They produced the first pharmacies. There were 80 pharmacies with licenses to practice pharmacy. They created distillation, calcination, sublimation. These are technical pharmacy terms. They created the ability to make drugs. They used alcohol by distilling it from grain into a purified form in surgery and to cauterize wounds and also to take extracts of herbs.
The early Muslim concept of the hospital became the prototype for the development of modern hospitals.
The original hospital, in terms of a scientific hospital, is exclusively an Islamic production. It had a bit of a model in Persia. The Christian monks and so forth conducted a hospital, but turning it into a scientific institution with a botanical garden, with a nursing staff, with charts on each patient, with medical students in tow, with accurate record keeping, with scientific studies, taking 50 patients and testing half with a certain herb, half with something else, testing bloodletting to see if it really worked, for example, which Ar-Razi did and found it working for meningitis. That's exclusively an Islamic production. In fact, the hospitals were so popular for the Europeans that they would fake illness to get into the hospitals, the magnificent hospitals in Cordoba, in Cairo, and in Damascus.
One of Europe's best medical schools in France was founded by Arab doctors. Islam's influence on Europe was indeed responsible for the escape of Europe from the Dark Ages. Briffaut, in his book, The Making of Humanity, states, "It was not science only which brought Europe back to life. Other and manifold influences from the civilization of Islam communicated its first glow to European life."
The development of Hebrew grammar and scientific theories of linguistics and philology really developed out of the Islamic world because the Muslims were the first, really, in bringing scientific ideas of linguistics to the study of scriptural text in the Quran.
Islam cannot clash with Western civilization.
Well, the whole question of whether Islam is in clash with Western civilization, it can't clash with itself. It is Western civilization. It produced the first Western civilization in Spain, in Sicily, and in Italy. It produced the sciences. It produced the post office, the bank, the check, the airmail system, the first one. It produced the use of mathematics to do computerization ultimately. So when we take a jet, or if we do a math class, or if we're on a computer, we're Islamic at that point.
From the 8th through the 13th centuries in Spain under the Muslim Moors, some of Islam's greatest thinkers revolutionized Christian scholasticism. Some of those are Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Hazm, and Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd, known by the Latin as Averroes, was a philosopher, an Aristotelian, and an author of some of the most influential medical works.
Among Ibn Rushd's followers were Jewish thinkers, who called him the soul and intelligence of Aristotle. In fact, Jewish philosophers such as Ibn Maymun, known as Maimonides and Avispran, who were the main glory of Jewish intellect, were students of Ibn Rushd.
Maimonides is a powerful example of a great Jewish leader and contributor to the general world, both of Judaism, Islam, and even secular culture as well. Maimonides, of course, was the first Jewish physician to the Sultan of Egypt.
There was a kind of de facto collaboration between Jews and Muslims and Christians in scientific endeavor during the Middle Ages.
Islam enlightened the world with spirituality and social and industrial sciences, and added to the Judeo-Christian world a 1.7 billion Muslim population who adored and revered Jesus and Moses and all other Israelite prophets.
We have a world which is so small. We have people of all faiths living in all places, and we have the opportunity to learn from one another, to make friends with one another. Used to be it was separated by geography, but the geography is no longer separating us. Now, Christians are living all over the world, Muslims are living all over the world, Jews are living all over the world and interacting with each other.
I believe positive-minded Muslims, Jews, and Christians have an obligation to work together. The word salam clearly is related to shalom, and for us that means in the Hebrew wholeness, peace.
I tell them that a tree cannot live without a root, and the root of religion is love.
We all have a responsibility to listen. As a people, we can't go back to segregating ourselves, that we must come together more regularly, that is something that will feed us, and for tomorrow to be a hopeful tomorrow rather than a fearful tomorrow. This is the only way to be.
All religious communities, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, are forced today to re-examine those early points of contact and to reclaim the best of those points of coexistence and rationales for coexistence that exist within the tradition, and to build on that in the 21st century.
I think that what we have to do to get together is have humility. All of the faiths have to have more humility. Let's start a new crusade of comradeship,
لنبدأ حملة جديدة
friendship.
والصداقة.
We're in the same camp.
There is a place for acceptance of other religions within monotheism, within every expression of monotheism, but you don't always see it.
We are friends, and we love one another and help one another. We are members of the same family, sharing the great grandparenthood of a pair of people, Adam and Eve.
It's absolutely critical that Muslims and Christians and Jews work together in order to understand one another better, because the essence of the divine will is really the same between all of us. There are so many parallels, religious, social, moral, and ethical, in the three monotheistic religious traditions. It seems just a shame that we haven't done a better job of working together. We're all part of the same family, and we really have our differences. Sometimes those differences are substantial. Very often those differences are really quite petty. It's absolutely critical that we learn to be a little bit more generous and respectful of the other, so that we can learn to live together and to work together on common cause.
I think when we draw on the best heart of our faith traditions, we have the resources from God that we need to achieve peace and to live at peace with one another. And isn't this the desire of everyone who is a lover of God, is to live at peace with God and at peace with our neighbors. And the dynamic interaction between these religions could perhaps reveal something new in our own age that no one has discovered in ages past. It's a threshold to a brand new reality, and I believe it has God all over it.
During this film, we have taken you on a journey from the Prophet Muhammad's teachings and the birth of Islam through the Renaissance until today. Without Islam, the world as we know it would be very different than it is today. Islam affected major spiritual and social changes and was responsible for a multitude of inventions, forming some of today's languages, our own numbers and mathematical equations, hospitals and pharmacies as we know them today, commerce and trade, and countless other achievements. Europe's recovery from the Dark Ages might not have been so successful or even possible without Islam. Columbus would have never made it to the New World. Islam gave women dignity and rights that they never had before. It leveled the educational playing field and gave everyone the opportunity to learn, to attend higher education and universities, and it opened the way for everyone, regardless of religion or gender, to better themselves, hindered only by their own level of ambition and desire to be successful. Islam and the Prophet Muhammad also restored peace in Arabia and beyond. This was possible through his lead by example, by his rational approach in dealing with the matters he faced, and by his character. Islam's teachings are the same today as they were in the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Over 1.7 billion Muslims are drawn to Islam and Muhammad's teachings for this reason, as well as spirituality, justice, a strong belief in God, and countless other reasons. They are just as inspired by the teachings of Jesus, Moses, and Abraham as they are in Muhammad's teachings. Islam transcends barriers, building fraternity between all people, whether they are Christians, Jews, or other ethnic or non-ethnic communities. It should not be surprising that Christians and Jews can read about Jesus Christ, Moses, Abraham, and all the prophets of the Old Testament in the Holy Quran. It is true that the messages of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are different, but at their core, these religions are closer than you may think or want to think, but there is no denying of what is true. Peace builds human dignity and is also considered a victory. Pope John Paul II said, "Everyone knows that violence always spawns violence. War throws open the doors to the abyss of evil. War, therefore, must always be considered a defeat of reason and humanity. Thus, may there soon be a spiritual and cultural impulse that will induce people to ban war. Yes, war. Never again." Christians, Jews, and Muslims all teach about a global peace, loving their neighbor, and accepting of others who are different. Let's all, whether we be Jews, Christians, or Muslims, learn about each other's religions, not so that we can see the differences, but that we can rejoice in the similarities.